Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Well, howdy folks, my name is Lester Ryan Clark.
And I'm Keenan Diaz.
And we're the hosts of the Exorcist Minute, a show where we examine, extrapolate, and excavate the scariest movie of all time.
Each episode covers a single minute of William Friedkin's 1973 horror masterpiece, The Exorcist.
If you like deep dives, this show is the deepest.
Did you know the film's iconic theme song, Tubular Bells, wasn't written specifically for the movie?
Or that the 1973 audience members were throwing up and fainting in the theater before they ever got a glimpse of the demon?
Or what about all the crazy on-set mishaps, cast injuries, the director firing real guns?
Ooh. Ever wonder where Ouija boards came from or how they got their name? How about some history on the Catholic Church or the Roman rite of exorcism? Or maybe we can tempt you with some juicy demonology lore. Did you know that Pazuzu had an ex-wife? Find The Exorcist Minute on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your shows or at theexorcistminute.com. Until next time, folks,
the power of The Exorcist compels you.
Ever wonder what bridges the gap between your favorite film genres, subgenres, and movements? Cinemascope is here to explore these connections, taking you on a thrilling odyssey through the ever-evolving art of cinema. I'm your host, Andy Nelson, and in each episode, we embark on a deep dive into the forces that sculpt the world of film. From the styles you know and love, like heist films or the French New Wave, to the ones you may not be as familiar with, like Turkish Yeşilçam or Brazilian Nordwesterns, my expert guests and I unravel the complex tapestry of storytelling, style, and innovation that defines the world of film as we unpack the myriad catalysts of change that shape these diverse styles. Whether you're a student of film, a creative professional, or simply a devoted movie enthusiast, Cinemascope is your gateway to a richer, more immersive film experience. Don't just watch movies, understand them, appreciate them, and revel in their artistry with Cinemascope. Subscribe today.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, we've talked about a lot of different superpowers, including the ability to play chess, the ability to survive high school life while also trying to learn martial arts. And today we're going to talk about the superpower that's involved in getting someone like me to care about what 25 people may or may not do with a ball a couple hundred miles away from me one night in October. We're talking about sports fandom, Sportsball, as many people in the various worlds that we like to inhabit will often refer to it as, but something that is still beloved by a lot of folks, myself included. And I'll be talking with Paul and Riki today, talking about like what it is we like about some kinds of sports, one things that some of the challenges in sports fandom, and some of the, I think, the real ethical questions that come up around it. And we're going to talk about things like the finances that get involved, the issues of what does it mean when you care about a team and the owner clearly does not necessarily care about the fans and all that kind of stuff, as well as what does it mean when you're a fan of a team and some people on that team or the ethos of the team itself is pretty terrible. Something that I, as a New York Jets fan, have been dealing with quite a lot this last season and the season beforehand. So I am here wearing my New York Mets shirt. Some people on the video can see who have lost last night's game, but I'm counting on that the magic will still continue. But let me just start by asking both of you, what is it you like about sports to the extent that you do? Okay, how would you describe yourself in terms of a fan or an enthusiast or a reluctant hater or whatever, however you want to describe your relationship to sports ball?
I guess I'll go first. I would say that I am now a fan of sports in general, just the act of sporting, but not of any team. And that's something we can discuss as like identity as a fan. But for me, like I like sports because it is unscripted. It's unscripted drama. So if you're watching a game, you don't know what's going to happen, and sometimes that results in boring games. But the moments when it's good are just so good, like better than any movie, right? And for me, like I will never forget the 2001 World Series, which is often still thought of as one of the best World Series within the last 50 years. It was just a magical moment. It was New York Yankees versus Arizona Diamondbacks, improbable comebacks on the heels of 9/11, New York City was the focal point of a lot of interest in the United States. And there was a period where for good reason, everyone poured their hearts out for the city of New York. And that World Series, in my mind, it became okay again for us fans / haters to hate the Yankees again. and it was
as
just
New Yorkers, don't worry, we hated the Yankees the whole time. On 9/11, afterwards.
But there was a time, where you had to be like, oh, like New York, like we love you.
Right.
And during that World Series, like, no, we hate you again. Specifically the Yankees. And, nothing against people living there or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah, I love that answer. Like, I really don't know what I was going to say, but I do think the unscripted drama element, like the level of drama, and I mean, especially baseball, I think this can be true in games with a clock. There's something about a buzzer beater that's really special, but games with a clock and a game clock, obviously baseball now is a pitch clock, which I won't get into all that yet, but but like having a game clock, I think there is this element of, just the last second, getting something done at the last second, and there can be a lot of excitement. But then sometimes it's like, okay, well, there's 5 seconds left, and then you just have to kneel the ball, and then it's like there are these huge anticlimaxes. Baseball also has anticlimaxes, as do other games without a game clock, but there is this element of like, well, as long as you keep doing good things, like the game won't end until you do a bad thing, right? It won't just end because the time's up. And so you can get these moments of drama that can just last for a long time. Like there was in this, I think it was game 4 of the National League Division Series this year, Mets against Phillies. There was a moment when one of the announcers was actually like, can we turn the pitch clock off for now? Like I want this moment to last longer. Like the drama between between the batter and the pitcher and things building up. And, I became a baseball fan, I'll say, when I was 8, actually when I was 7, and just before 1986. And all my friends were Yankees fans, and I was like, I'm going to be a Mets fan. And I don't know whether it was my contrarian nature or the 12-story mural of Dwight Gooden basically outside my bedroom, but I just picked a team, and then they won the World Series. I was like, oh, this is fun, and that was also regarded as, one of the great World Series of all time and postseason overall. And there were all these moments that I felt like I actually learned really formative lessons. Like, it ain't over till it's over. Like really, as you're not eliminated until you are, and to never give up basically, and things like that. And then the next year and the year after that and the year after that and the year after that, I learned that sports isn't all about just winning championships. It's a lot of heartbreak and trying hard and then not getting there. And, as a fan, you're an observer, but there's this emotional investment. As a competitor, it's a little different. And having, been a competitor at times in my life, and I mean, kind of for a living with poker, but there is this very different experience of being in the moment and focusing on you have a job to do and you're just trying to get it done, and then not being the competitor and sitting there and watching someone else and really wanting them to succeed. And for me, it's not this Seinfeld rooting for the laundry. If I don't like the players on the team, I'm not going to root for the team. I'm going to stop liking the team for a while. And then years like this, I've just gotten invested in the Mets story, with a little nudge from Matthew and some games to watch. I'm like, okay, I'll watch some games. And then just, kind of the story of how a season can go and seeing individual players' struggles and then seeing them overcome their struggles and just getting emotionally invested in wanting a good outcome for the players. For me, it's been a very different experience this year than when I was younger. And one thing that I enjoy about sports and competition in general is that I feel just different people can get different things from it. And that's cool. That can all fit together, and I have a lot of thoughts about competition and maybe it's not really such a good thing, but when it's done with a I don't know, kind of with like a positive attitude, with an idea, not like a spiteful thing, but kind of like there was a moment in the wild card series this year where the Mets had like played this amazing game against the Brewers, and then the Brewers hit 2 home runs, and it just looked like the Mets season was over, except, maybe it wasn't, because they'd had all these comebacks. And then Francisco Lindor leads off with a walk, and he gets to first base, and he like pats the first baseman like on the butt, like as they do in sports, in this kind of like, hey, that was like a good home run you just hit. And this is like the season's on the line, and like he's like acknowledging a player on the other team for like doing something cool that might like end his season. And then it went the other way, and it didn't, then the Brewers lost. But like it was just this moment of like seeing competitors give one another credit, and while still competing, like, I'm going to try as hard as I can to beat you. And then if you beat me, like, good game, like, good job, congratulations. And you don't always see that, sometimes you see quite the opposite. But so kind of, I mean, just overall, there's this huge range of human emotion that you can go through watching a game, playing a game. And sometimes it's boredom, and sometimes it's excitement, and sometimes it's positive excitement, and sometimes it's negative excitement, and heartbreak. And I'm not sure if I like it anymore, but I know that I find it engaging, and I can find it like hard to look away, So there's my ramble.
So 2 great rambles, because I have like 8 different topics I want to respond to. But let me first start by asking a question. I couch this as kind of a general like sports idea. So far, everything we've been talking about is baseball, and part of that's because we're in October. We're in the World Series, with the build to the World Series, the playoffs. The team that Paul and I root for, as well as the team that Paul and I root for, the Mets, are currently playing the Dodgers, which I know is your team, Riki.
It is not.
Oh, okay. Well,
I feel like
as I said, I
that
have
it's not
no
about
allegiance.
the team, right?
Like, I live in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
I love Shohei Ohtani, but I'm not a Dodgers fan. Like, and
fair,
this
fair,
might
okay.
seem like semantics, but they are
No.
important. Like,
No,
they are
it's an
important
important
to my
distinction.
identity.
Yeah.
Right? And I feel like this is an interesting thing about sports, is like when we identify with a team, like,
Right.
it means a lot to you personally.
Mm-hmm.
And it does mean a lot to me to not identify as a Dodgers fan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've got something to that point later, but go ahead, Matthew.
Let me rephrase the question. It's a very good point. I guess more what I meant is that all 3 of us have reasons to care about the teams or players that are currently playing in the October playoffs. And so it makes sense we're talking a lot about baseball.
Mm-hmm.
I know that for myself, there are a number of sports that I really care about, football being one of them, although I find I don't really care about the team, kind of like, Paul, what you were saying, because I just don't like one of them, the main player, and the direction they're going. But I also really love basketball and some other things. Where do you all fall in terms of other sports?
I like basketball a lot, but again, like, this comes to like what I like, and for me, it was the Tim Duncan era San Antonio Spurs was my favorite team. He's my favorite basketball player in my lifetime so far. And after he retired, and most of, I think all at this point of those championship team players retired, I lost a lot of interest. I know that there's an interesting new player on the Spurs. I think Victor Wemby is his nickname, Wembanyama, I think. He's got like a wingspan that's just enormous, and he does amazing things. So seeing clips of him has kind of re-sparked my interest, and like, maybe I want to pay attention to this team again and watch some more basketball. But it's been a couple of years. Like, I think I watched the NBA finals, a couple of them with the Golden State Warriors, because Steph Curry was on a hot streak and very fascinating as a player. But it's been a couple of years. I don't care for NFL football at all, American football. Pretty much ever since the Colin Kaepernick stuff, I just lost all interest in caring about them. This year we had the Olympics. Didn't watch as much this year. But I think the Olympics is a really fascinating sports thing because what Paul mentioned earlier about kind of the sporting behavior of acknowledging, your competitor.
Yeah.
The Olympics is the height of that. Like those people like really love and care for their fellow competitors on a level that is different, I think, from a lot of these professional sports leagues.
Yeah.
There's one moment for the Olympics that really stands out for me. You're right; it happens all the time, but there was, in women's gymnastics, the American women's team was incredibly dominant, as they normally are. Simone Biles being just one of the most, I think, possibly the best athlete of our generation, if not ever. And she and there was one particular event, I think it was floor exercise, where there was a Brazilian team that, like, Brazil isn't really known as a gymnastics powerhouse, but this time they did very well. And in this one particular event, I think it was floor exercise, but write in if I'm wrong. Both she and the other American, who were very good, came in second and third to this Brazilian woman who won the gold medal, and who was considered very much kind of like the huge underdog to these two. And rather than, like, oh my God, how could we have lost? We have to do better. There's this beautiful picture of them on the medal stand with the other two, with Simone and the other American, kind of like bowing down to her, recognizing this was the first time a Brazilian had won a gold. I think the first time someone from South America had won gold in a women's gymnastics event. I might be wrong on that, but it was just this wonderful moment of, like, we are considered the absolute best in the world, but we are acknowledging you because you beat us today. And that is, really worthy of support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that ability to give credit to someone for beating you, I think, is one of the, not like, oh, I had a bad day and, they got lucky or something, like, no, you won, like,
yeah,
good job. And I feel like it's, yeah, I think that's a really important thing in competition in general, and, sports specifically. And the Olympics is something that I haven't watched a lot, largely because of, like, feelings about countries and competing for countries and these things. And in the US, the broadcasts are so heavily dominated by, like, oh, here's the 8th place, finisher from the US. And, oh yeah, by the way, this person finished first, and, stuff like that. But I do remember in 2004 when I was running in Taekwondo school, and they had the Summer Olympics in Greece, and in Taekwondo, there was this amazing gold medal match. Well, it didn't last that long. Moon Dae-sung of South Korea knocked out Alexandros Nikolaidis of Greece, who's, the hometown guy, who's like 6'7" or something, this huge guy, and the shorter Korean guy who was like 6'3" and like, knocks him out with like a jumping reverse turning kick or spinning heel kick, or like something that, like, is way cooler than anything you see in Cobra Kai. But, like, it was like, it was a cinematic end to the thing, and the guy was like kind of half knocked out, and that was the match. And, he goes and he celebrates with his, his family, his team, whatever. And then he comes back and, like, he keeps like holding up the Greek guy's hand, like, no, you, and
yeah.
They just had this like really great moment and the Greek guy was like, no, you, and where you could tell that, like, they really cared about each other as competitors, even though, I feel like fighting sports are even the epitome of, like, you're literally trying to physically hurt the other person, like, not necessarily cause injury, but like you're hitting them. And then it's like, if you can then still have this like respect of, like, we are, we're competing on, we're both doing something that we both know, like, I know how hard what you're doing is, and so I think there's a level of respect there that is enjoyable. And the Olympics, I think, are cool for just the sheer variety of, like, athletic endeavors. And, you see, like, how different body types tend to excel at different sports and things, right? Like, there's, like a baseball player is generally built differently from a basketball player, but like a shot putter is built a lot different from, most of the athletic thing. I mean, maybe a shot putter might be like a slugger in baseball, or a line person in in football or something. But yeah, like, American football never interested me a ton. Like, I went to a couple games as a kid. It was cold. And like, there was like a year or two that I would watch on TV a little bit, and I didn't have a team. And that I think that is an interesting experience of just kind of like I'm just going to watch this game. And I would always like pick a team, usually be whoever was losing or whoever was like the underdog. Like I just have a thing for, I tend to end up rooting for the underdog. You know, soccer, I always loved as a game, or football and, you know, most of the rest of the world outside of the US. But like, I never found it televised that well at the time, at least, you know, because kind of the scope of it, it's hard to, I think different sports are easier or harder to catch in broadcast, you know, and like, if you look at baseball broadcasts from the 80s compared to now, like now it's like, why would I even go to a game when I can see what I can see on like, you know, SNY or something. Yeah. And then I'd say in terms of sports that I actually have like invested in, like tennis in the past, you know, not so much anymore, but you know, the Federer Nadal era, I was definitely, you know, and my wife was a huge Federer fan, and my mom's a huge Nadal fan, and they're like the other tennis lovers in my life. So, you know, that rivalry was interesting.
My interest in tennis, again, like it's about who you enjoy and who you root for, and my interest in tennis has definitely waned since Serena Williams retired.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and just the last thing I'd mention is chess, that like I've probably watched more of and like gotten invested in more of, and they have these ridiculous 6-hour long games, and it's like, you know, it can be boring, it can be interesting, there's a lot of subtlety, and then all of a sudden it can devolve into some like, you know, seconds long blitzing out moves and just feel totally different, and you get sometimes, you know, just these huge moments of excitement after just a long, like the long build up, I think is often what like makes the excitement as exciting.
Yeah, I think so.
You know?
So there's a couple. Now I meant that to be like a 5-second question, but of course that is so much.
My bad.
No, it's great. It's great. But actually, so let me add to things, a list of things I want to talk about. But I'm mostly to talk about, like, I think the two things that came up that are for me really why I love sports. Because I underlined so many of the things you guys said, but the first actually was really kind of highlighted by Riki, what you said about 9/11. Because for me as a New Yorker, I really love sports. Was a huge part of my coming back. Sports was a huge part of me, I think, kind of healing from 9/11 in a lot of ways. And I will say, you know, I did not lose anyone personally. I had friends who lost people. But there was an extent to which, like, as a New Yorker, we really felt like our city was attacked. You know, it fundamentally changed so many things about our city, the skyline that we saw on a daily basis. And I by no means want to undercut, like, you know, the families themselves who were affected and the loved ones and the people and all that. But like, it just was an attack against our city in so many ways. And the first baseball game that was played was a New York Mets game against the Atlanta Braves. The New York Mets were not that good that year, but they'd been to the World Series the year before. And the Braves had been our perennial rival. And especially this guy named John Rocker, who was their ace closer,
that guy is an a-hole.
Yeah, yes. That's kind of the point.
Exactly.
And he had a lot of terrible things to say about the city, which, you know, you could read as just like city versus country, but like there's a lot of anti-Semitism coded, a lot of racism coded. And so for Mike Piazza, our kind of like hometown star, who, I mean, not from New York City, but just, you know, he'd become utterly beloved. Eduardo Alfonso, also utterly beloved, got a walk. And then Piazza came up against, I think it was Rocker. It might have been wrong. The narrative will last, the fairy tale that often isn't necessarily based on the truth. But and Paul, I was at that game. Paul, were you with me at that game?
I was with you at that game. Yes.
Okay.
We were there with Dave.
Nice.
And you know, we were losing 1-0, and then Piazza hit a home run in like the 7th or 8th inning, and it was just, it just felt like New York was back in such this incredibly powerful moment. And I think that's something that really ties into me with something that I learned as a kid, which is just the social power that sports can have. And I think in many ways that can be terrible. It can lead to a lot of bad things. We're going to talk about that. But, you know, I grew up with a father who had grown up in Brooklyn. He grew up in Far Rockaway, which is technically in Queens, but is so connected to Brooklyn that he was very much a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And he grew up in the 40s and 50s. And to hear my father tell it, like when he would tell me stories about the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King was great, like the whole bus stuff and like the desegregation, that was great. But really, Jackie Robinson was why we had better racial situation in the country today. And he just loved telling me about how much Jackie Robinson playing for the Dodgers and the whole story of how like he faced so much hate, but he the way he wouldn't back down from it, but also wouldn't, fall to that level. And the friendship that he wound up building with some of the people on the team, and and just how much that changed people and affected people was something that I really took to heart. And so it's always been kind of a part of, for me, the narrative of how sports can be this incredibly good social force. And also, therefore, I think why, as you brought up, Riki, something like Colin Kaepernick is so powerful in the other direction of a time when, the sports ownership is really kind of giving a green light to the worst parts of racism and, I think it was Shaquille O'Neal. I forget. There was some basketball player who was talking about Black Lives Matter, maybe LeBron James, but he and someone responded to him in an interview with like, just shut up and dribble. Like your job.
I'm pretty sure that was LeBron James. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so I think those things have been always a part of why I've never thought like watching the United States play in the Olympics does nothing for me. I have very little national pride, but you could tell me that New York City isn't engaged in a who can chew more bubblegum contest with the people of London, and I am going to root so hard because I just feel so much like pride and love of New York. And so I think that's one part that I've also been a fan of. The other thing I think for me with sports fandom is it's been a huge connection with my family. For years and years, my father and I had a really rough relationship. Sports was one of the only things that we could connect on. And so a lot of my love, especially of basketball, of the New York Knicks and of college basketball, really comes from that. And my mother was a diehard Jets fan. And at a time when I don't think I really cared that much about sports until I was living in New York City again. I didn't care about football as much until I was living with my mother. After college, I was living in New York City and visiting her a lot, and she was already starting to really not do well. Addiction was really hitting her hard. And the happiest moment of her week was watching the New York Jets on Sunday and then watching them in the playoffs. And it meant so much to her, and it came to mean so much to me. And again, the kind of family dynamics around sports can become really problematic. And people who grow up in families where they don't love the team that your parents love, or especially your father loves, or you don't love the sport, can be horrific, especially in particularly in situations where someone might be queer, although by no means does it mean that queer people can't love sports, or that straight kids who don't like sports don't go through this. But all the things around misogyny and homophobia and all that stuff can get really wrapped up in family dynamics around sports. But for me, at least, I will never watch a Jets game and not think of my mother. I'll never watch basketball and not think of my father. My father's still alive, to be clear. My mother's not. But I think that's, for me, one of the reasons why sports is so important to me is because of how much of a family connection it has.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of room for powerful dynamics, which can be positive and can be negative, right? Depending on the family dynamic and how that does or doesn't relate to sports. For me, I remember specifically sitting on the couch at my friend's house upstairs with my dad, my friend, his dad, his mom. And then my mom had to go downstairs to take out the VHS and switch it because the game had gone to extra innings. And so the tape had run out. So they had to go back and record the end of Game 6 of the World Series in 1986. And I remember my friend sitting there and his dad being like, now don't be mean about, when the Red Sox inevitably win this game, and my dad was just sitting behind me, just rubbing my back, knowing that I cared so much about it. And, and then they won. And that's a family memory, that's one of my last really happy memories with maybe it's my last really happy memory with my dad. I mean, we watched Game 7 together, but a bunch of us watched Game 7 together, and it didn't have that same that moment. So every time I see that, or every time somebody talks about Game 6, or now the Mets are playing the Dodgers, and it's they're in the National League Championship Series. If they get to the World Series, they haven't won a World Series since 1986. It's it always comes up, right? And so that's a really happy memory, but then he died that winter, and then the Mets have never won a World Series since. So like there hasn't been a moment quite like that one. But I was there with you on I think it was September 21st of 2001, the first game back in New York. And the Mets weren't that good that year, but they had actually been really bad for a while. And then they went on a stretch of winning, like, I think they lost 5 out of 26 or something like that, like some ridiculous run. And this was during that run, and they were playing the Braves, who they were chasing for the division, and they didn't quite catch them. But this game, they beat them, and it was 2-1, and it was off of Steve Karsay. But it doesn't matter. It would have been nicer if it was off of Rocker. I think Rocker did blow a save in another time. But like, it was this, like, the Mets, the New York Mets had beaten their rival, the not New York Braves. And like, it didn't matter that it was Atlanta. It was just, it's not New York. Mm-hmm. And the stadium there was like this feeling. It was like a healing feeling, I mean, it had been 10 days and the city felt different for that whole time. And I mean, I still remember the like moment of silence in the beginning of the game, and they have this enormous flag, and I'm not a fan of flags, but it's, this piece of fabric that's probably like 100 feet by 100 feet or more or whatever. I guess it's not square, but like you could hear it flapping in a stadium of 55,000 people, The
loudest silence I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, exactly. And then like Liza Minnelli comes up and sings New York, New York, during, I don't know if it was a 7th inning stretch or if it was in the middle of the 8th, but so, in the bottom of the 8th, Piazza hits this just absolute moonshot. I was about to say bomb. That feels like a bad choice of words, even though there were no bombs involved in that year. But like, it did feel like it was this moment that had meaning beyond the game. And obviously Jackie Robinson, playing baseball, stepping on a Major League Baseball field and playing for the Dodgers was this moment. And then that whole season and all of that, I think that had meaning beyond the game. I mean, baseball was integrated before a lot of other things, and it should have been earlier, right? The whole thing shouldn't have been the way it was in the first place. But like those things and those moments, I do feel there is an impact outside of sports that can be positive, and in those instances, I feel like it has been.
Yeah, I mean, even tying it into what you were talking about, Riki, at the beginning of the 2001 World Series, one of the things that I most remember from that is that the Arizona Diamondbacks had a closer named Byung-Hyun Kim, who was a fantastic pitcher, had a great year, and was, I don't know if he was the first Korean player, but he was certainly one of the first Korean players to be a really big name. And the Yankees hit him really hard the first couple of games. And I remember, like, I was already kind of uncomfortable with some of the stuff, but then, the response to it was incredibly racist from a lot of fans, both some within New York but also without. And how much you could see how much it was killing him to have that happen, and for the team to win, felt like such a moment of vindication for him, because I think he did have a couple of really good outings later in the series. And it just felt like such a vindication for him, and the idea of sports being something that isn't just for one group of people. And that Jackie Robinson was breaking one line, and that God, I can't remember. It was a hitter for the Yankees, I think, was the first of the big stars to come from Asia and then do really well. Whose name I now can't remember. But it just felt like,
for which team?
I think for the Yankees, he was someone who was like considered the Japanese Babe Ruth.
Hideki Matsui.
Matsui, thank you.
Was probably the best Yankee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't. I can't remember if there were any other big Korean stars before Kim, but it was one more reason why it felt like just such an incredible moment. So
yeah, Kim. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking. I think there was a first baseman for the Cubs, Choi. Hee-Sop Choi, maybe.
That sounds right.
I can't remember if he was the first though.
Yeah.
But yeah, Kim. He got hit pretty hard in games 3 and 4. I want to say. I have very vivid memories of that World Series. Like I said, that is my most endearing sporting moment. I would say.
That was an amazing series and had moments. And I was rooting for the Diamondbacks too, and was a Byung-Hyun Kim fan, and was really devastated when he kept giving up these, big game tying hits to the Yankees. Because and it's funny because I was doing Taekwondo a lot at the time, and my teachers from South Korea, and his last name's Kim as well, and he was a Yankees fan. So he had like a very different take on Byung-Hyun Kim, who I think was like 22 or something. Like he was like a really young guy at the time. Chan-ho Park, I think, was maybe the first Korean player. He was certainly the first big star. And
Chan-ho
I mean, to
Park.
the point where whenever I visited Korea in like 02, 03, and 05, tons of people had Dodgers hats, because Chan-ho Park pitched for the Dodgers first. And yeah, there've been a number, but Byung-Hyun Kim might have been I don't know. Oh, Chan-ho Park was only 20 when he debuted in MLB. Wow. Because there's a whole different system in terms of signing with a Major League Baseball team compared to in Japan, right? Which has the whole posting system. And there's a book, The Meaning of Ichiro, that gets into a lot of the history of Japanese baseball, and specifically Japanese baseball players in the United States. But one thing I've noticed recently, like this season, is that there are a lot of Asian American baseball players in MLB now, or like half Asian or whatever, which I feel like 20, 30 years ago you didn't see. And so there's like this influx of superstars mostly from Japan, but also from Korea and some from probably Taiwan, maybe China. I don't know if mainland China.
Well, it's now been about 30 years since Hideo Nomo debuted for the Dodgers. So what you probably have is people who literally grew up watching Hideo Nomo and then Ichiro Suzuki, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
In the United States.
Well, I think a part of that is, Paul, I might be misunderstanding you, but I think part of what you're getting at is also that, like, with that first generation, and still today to a large extent as well, you often had people who were very successful professional careers in Japan.
Yeah.
And then kind of like, there was sort of a sense of like, oh, we're still looking at that as the minor leagues, but okay, if you're really good in Japan, then we'll give you a chance here in America. Whereas now it's people who are, instead of signing with a professional team in Japan or Korea, they're being noticed and then signing with someone in the United States. No.
I mean, like, American citizen, like people who were born in the United States.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think some of it is just, I mean, it's not like, yay, racism solved or anything, but I do think there's this idea of like, stereotypically like Asian Americans not being jocks, like historically. And that's not the case in the same way, I think, anymore. I mean, I can't speak to the experience, right? But just from seeing like that there's a lot of Asian Americans, born in the United States who grow up and become professional baseball players. And that, like Jeremy Lin was, I mean, we're talking about basketball, right? But like, that was a big deal because there weren't a bunch of other Chinese American basketball players. Right. And I don't follow the NBA, so I can't really speak to how much that's changed. But I do think seeing Hideo Nomu come over, seeing Chan-ho Park have success, like I have to think that has an influence in terms of just being like, oh, I can do that, as opposed to being told like you can't, right? And so
yeah, I remember Alexander Rodriguez, A-Rod, definitely not my favorite player for a lot of reasons, but I did always think it was really interesting when he had a very successful career that there've been a ton of Latino baseball players, but for whatever reason, my understanding is that it's much more common for them to be born in somewhere in Central or Caribbean or South America and then come here rather than to be just Latino American. And Alex Rodriguez was, I think he was born in the Bronx, and people always were kind of surprised by that because they were so used to, if you were a Latino player, then you probably were born in the Dominican Republic or Costa Rica or Argentina or something like that. So.
Yeah, and that's just no longer the case to the extent that it wasn't.
Let's talk about some of the downsides. We've talked, and we'll keep kind of mixing it back and forth. I don't think it's just, blue versus red or anything like that. And I'm going to start with the New York Jets because, as I said, I have been a big fan of them ever since, since I was a kid, and Ken O'Brien and those teams, but especially the teams with Curtis Martin and then, Mark Sanchez and Rex Ryan and the butt fumble and all that. But I love those teams. They were always the underdog, and they always they won through great defense. And Paul, you talked about being a competitor. I wasn't much of an athlete in high school, but in college, I really got myself into shape, and I played rugby. And I played rugby on a team that wound up winning a lot of state championships in New York State. D3, not D1, to be very clear. But I kind of intentionally went to a small college where I could play instead of a D1 school where I could watch. And I played rugby, but I was basically the equivalent of like a lineman. I think I carried the ball in one game in my 4-year career, and I almost scored. I came close, which was annoying. But mostly, it was my job to like help other people look better. And it says a lot about my personality. I think my love of being basically an offensive lineman and like helping to get someone else to score, and my love of being a rhythm guitarist and like being there while someone else can play lead guitar is like very linked.
Yeah, story checks out.
Yeah, therapists can have a lot of fun with that. But I think it really gave me an appreciation for like sports where, it wasn't just like the...
Okay, so Matthew was talking about the New York Jets, and I think the point he wants to get, like, this was what I thought from the very beginning when they suggested the topic. What they wanted to talk about is how terrible of a human being Aaron Rodgers is. And it's... Look, I get it, because the last football team I identified as a fan of was the Green Bay Packers. Okay. So I followed the early parts of Aaron Rodgers' career, and he was just like a good quarterback, right? And it was fun to root for a good team and win some championships.
Sure.
But recently, I mean, he has been on podcasts with some questionable people and has espoused views on like vaccines and stuff, anti-vax views that are very, in my opinion, very problematic, right? Like what I think it is okay to be skeptical of like governments and how they utilize science, and we should always be vigilant of such things, because there are obviously like historical issues with like the Tuskegee experiments where governments have used science and medicine, the veil of science and medicine, to do some pretty abhorrent things.
Absolutely.
But vaccines, in my opinion, especially when there's a global pandemic, like that is for the greater good. And we should have a degree of trust that the people in charge of governments are looking out for our health in that case. And I don't like... There's a fine line between being a skeptic of the government and their efforts. We're talking about Aaron Rodgers' anti-vax views and just like outright spreading conspiracy theories, right? And saying like, no, don't get vaccinated because like they are injecting microchips in you to track you. Like, I don't know how far specifically his views go on this, but as someone with such a large following and platform, like, you can't espouse views like that without being like a medical expert. Like, I did my research on the internet, like as a quarterback, NFL quarterback, like isn't good enough. Like, you are not a medical expert, and the people you are reading are probably not medical experts.
I got kicked off for a few minutes, but I'm guessing you all decided to run with my anti-Jets feelings.
I just talked about Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and I think that I've had a lot of really negative feelings about what the Jets did in signing Rodgers, just because I think it's and this is a whole other set of dynamics we can discuss that is more, I think it doesn't really have much of a significance on the greater world as much as it is sports in general, but there's often a tendency of like, we have to win now in rather than building up a solid team structure for years and years. And I always saw the Jets have tried to do this for a number of times. This is not the first aging quarterback that we've signed at the end of his career. This is not the first aging, formerly great Green Bay Packers quarterback we've signed at the end of the year. The last one was Brett Favre, who also turned out to be
also a terrible human being
in a lot of ways, and I hope is going to be in a Mississippi jail one day for what he did in terms of like stealing funds from their public works funds and stuff like that. I don't know how the details of that straight. But yeah, with Aaron Rodgers, it really posed, for me at least, this conundrum. And I remember saying, like, in that kind of way, like, there's not a day that goes by that I don't wish my mother was still alive and still with me. But like something I've said a couple times, especially with Trump winning, but also was like, I'm glad my mom's not around to see this anymore, because, I think she and I would have had a lot of discussions about it. And in many ways, I was afraid that kind of the Jets would start winning and I would be like, oh, but I love this team, I got to root for them. And I was kind of glad that like I didn't, when there were people would be like, oh, hey, the Jets won a good game last night, aren't you happy? And I'd be like, no, not really. Like, and the last couple weeks, the Jets have had a chance to win in the last moments, and Aaron Rodgers has thrown an interception. And one of them was not really his fault. The other one was definitely his fault. And certainly the other interception, like he's just not playing very well. And for me, it's had this moment of Schadenfreude that's been kind of like, yeah, I told you guys this was a dumb idea. Yeah. So all the way just, and I the anti-vax thing is to me what is primary. He's also just a horrible team player. He basically like is the press tries to tell you a lot about the personality of people, and I always want to like avoid that. But it's pretty clear that he got the most recent coach of the Jets fired because the guy, they were disagreeing on some things, which is just, I think, a level of player control that's not great. And the owner of the Jets, Woody Johnson, is a huge Trump supporter, and I think just buys into a lot of these same things. So it's been a rough time as a Jets fan. But I think I'm kind of glad that I'm able to take pretty much the stance that, Paul, you were talking about of I love the Jets, I want the Jets to do well, but I don't want them to win like this.
And I want to draw a distinction of, in my opinion, like why it is okay for LeBron James to talk about Black Lives Matter, but it's not okay for Aaron Rodgers to espouse anti-vax opinions. And that's like the expertise. Like LeBron James is a Black man who grew up in the United States of America. He knows and understands racism on a very personal level. And he also, has friends, family who are going to be Black, and has lived an experience and has been around people who have lived an experience, and to advocate for, his group of people, like his race, right? Like that is something that I think athletes should be allowed to do. Aaron Rodgers is not a scientist. Like he's not a medical expert. Like, and so he's not an expert on the things that he's talking about. And that's why I think like I draw a distinction in that of like when it's okay for athletes to express opinions on things.
I actually even want to take that one step further, because I can imagine some folks would say, oh, but you probably all agree with Black Lives Matter and disagree with the vaccine thing. For me, I would even take it further to talk about Charles Barkley. Charles Barkley he's shifted a lot in later years, but he's one of the best basketball players to ever live. If he hadn't been so obsessed with hitting 3-point shots, he would have had the highest shooting percentage of anyone ever, which is kind of something I kind of love about him. And he was very outspoken about the fact that he never wanted to be a role model, and that he was a Republican, and that he was a rich man. In his mind, like, he had money, and he didn't care about other Black people. He cared about, I restate that. It's not, what he cared about was, he thought, like, sure, Democrats are Republicans are racist, but so are Democrats. And, he had made his money, and he should be able to do everything he can to keep as much money as he wanted. And, everyone should go out and do the same. And so he was a Republican. I completely disagreed with him. It was not like LeBron James, where I support Black Lives Matter. But I think, Riki, that's a great example. But he was talking about his experience as a Black man and now as a rich man, and how those things interacted and what he thought was right. And I thought he had every right in the world to talk about those things. Like, that's a perspective that he has a level of expertise and understanding of that I don't have on either of those counts. And so, yeah, I really kind of want to echo what you're saying, and saying that it applies, though, I think, and I think we would probably all agree, whether or not we agree with what they're saying, but in terms of just where their perspective on it is.
It's perfectly. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I realize that I should have spoken for all three of us.
I definitely have a different perspective, but Riki, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's also perfectly valid for athletes to not speak on things, right? Like, because they are not politicians, they are not, government officials. Their job is to play the sport. And I think it's okay to just focus on that. Michael Jordan, very famously, I think, was asked to weigh in on like some political race in North Carolina where he lived. And he said, I don't want to get into it, because I think the quote is like, Republicans buy shoes too. So he was kind of hedging in one direction, but saying like, I'm not going to endorse anyone. Like, this is all I'm going to say on it. And that's very cynical, right? Like, because he, as a businessman, like as a spokesperson for Nike, I think, or was it Nike?
It was
Had
Nike,
That he didn't want to alienate part of his fan / customer base. So it's very cynical, but I think it's a valid position to take. Like, you don't have to weigh in on it as an athlete. You shouldn't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I feel like, I don't think like Aaron Rodgers shouldn't say his views. I just think his views are wrong and harmful, So I think I'm a little different in that regard. I do think like the fact that he has no experience, no like real understanding of what he's talking about. He has no expertise in that. I think is, that kind of should tell most people like, yeah, why would I listen to this person? But I do think overall, like, I don't think athletes are heroes. I mean, I know we're on superhero ethics. I think they are looked at that way, but like, athletes really are just people doing a job who are extremely good at something physical. Or I mean, if you want to include like esport or like chess or something mental, but like, and the mental side of any sport is a big deal as well. No matter how physical that sport is. But, I like the fact that someone's really good at one thing isn't a reason that people should really listen to them about stuff. But I do think that being so popular, right, means that your words are going to carry more weight in terms of both. Some people are going to give you credit for knowing things that you have no real expertise in. But also like just you're going to reach a wide audience. You have a huge platform, right? You're famous. You have a huge platform. So I do think like the consequence of saying something or not saying something, in Jordan's case, maybe is larger, and I do think saying like, hey, I'm an athlete. This is what I do. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to speak on this. Like, I think that's reasonable stance. I don't think it's the best stance. I mean, the best stance is to speak vocally for whatever I agree with. But, but like, and I do think there is a difference. Like, I think it's an important difference between LeBron and Rodgers in terms of having knowledge of something, having expertise or having an experience versus not having any expertise,
right?
Just doing some kind of like internet research or whatever, which like, I do think like you can actually learn about stuff on the internet. Like, this is real. You can, but you can also learn a lot of things that are not true on the internet. So
Google has gotten a lot, like Google search has gotten a lot worse.
Yeah.
Since the advent of, AI, there's just like more wrong information that you'll find through Google.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And, I feel like what Naomi Osaka did during, I think it was 2020. It had to be 2020, where she just wore like they were all wearing masks, and her masks just had like the name of someone murdered by police like each round, and it was like just a really to the point way of basically making a point. And like I'm sure she did interviews and talked about it, but it was like basically just like, I mean, I was gonna say in your face, but on her face, like just like there. And to me, it felt like a very powerful way of making a statement. And like, I'm sure some people are like, well, don't bring politics into sports. And it's like, okay, well, don't play a national anthem if you don't want politics in sports. Like, it's like, that is overtly political, playing a national anthem, which by the way, I think is absurd that they do that.
Yeah.
But
before, when you talked about Liza Minnelli singing
New York,
I thought about how much that meant to me.
Yeah.
Particularly because it was very soon after, and I'm proud to say New York was one of the last places to do this, but they started playing God Bless America at baseball games and then at all sporting events.
Yeah.
And that was hideous.
Yeah.
I think it's okay. So I want to be clear, like when I say athletes should be allowed to not express their opinions on politics or current events, I also think it's fine, like if they want to, but you have to be careful of like what is opinion and what is like a, like what Aaron Rodgers is doing is not an opinion. He is spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
And that to me is like where I would draw lines. It's like you can just say like if you want, you can say you support a certain politician or a political party or something. Like free speech is a thing, like, and you should be allowed to do that. There can be consequences. I think like free speech is not without consequences, but it shouldn't be like political consequences, right? Like it can just be like your fans don't like you anymore,
right?
Or you lose endorsement deals from some companies. Like that has to be like an acceptable thing. And then like we as fans and as a society can also like supplementally decide should those consequences have applied. Like in like going back to Colin Kaepernick, my opinion is no. Like he expressed a very like important opinion on current events, and then essentially was blacklisted by the league and lost sponsorships and gained some sponsorships, I believe, as well. But like that's like the give and take in society and how we decide like what direction we're going to move in as a group.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it's a really good reminder also that, you know, there's a lot of good different tropes and sayings around the idea of that, you know, not staying something as a support of the status quo, and that like many things are much more political than we think they are. And the national anthem, the flying of flags at sporting events, I think is a huge part of that. But I think it goes much deeper than that. I think about how many, you know, the decision about whether or not a city or a state or a region is going to fund and or subsidize the arena that a sports team will play in, and just a whole discussion about like trying to get a sports team for a certain city or region is hugely political and economic. And I think there's a knee-jerk thought of it's necessarily bad. I don't think that's always the case. I think there can be ways in which a sport there can be times and instances where a sporting team and an arena can be a real economic benefit to an area, and also ways in which these teams can basically blackmail city governments to get them to pay an inordinate amount of money for things that are not going to help them very much. And I think we can't really talk about any of this without talking about the economics of sport. And a lot of that has to do with the individual players. And if anyone has a chance, I really suggest, you probably never heard of this guy unless you're pretty deep into sports world, but Curt Flood was the first person to really fight for free agency in baseball, which basically just means like a player's ability to sign for the team that he wants to play for, that she wants to play for now, they want to play for, and not to be really beholden, because there was an extent to which in baseball, and there still is in some ways, but in most professional sports, you really were kind of an indentured servant and paid a lot better than folks might have, you know, associate with those kind of terms, but still had very little control and not paid anything like what they're paid today. And I think today, it's a fair argument to say that like that pendulum may have swung too far in the other direction, but there's just so much about the economics of sport we don't talk about. And maybe a good way to talk about that, especially in terms of like, if a city or region puts a lot into a team because the team can give a lot back to it, what's the responsibility of that? Paul, do you have anything to say about the city of Oakland and certain sports franchises in that regard?
Yeah. So in the last 7 years or 8 years now, I spent 5 years in the Bay Area, North Bay. So not the East Bay, not San Francisco, but in that area. And then 2 years in Vegas. And that's pretty much an abbreviated timeline of the Raiders and soon to be the no longer Oakland A's. And I think of sports teams as basically being kind of like regional religions in a way, you know, where like people are generally indoctrinated in childhood, I think largely, in my view, irrational attachment or just like this, like it is what it is, you know, and it's not I am going to do this because it has this really clear value proposition. It's like this just what you end up rooting for, what you end up believing, basically, you know, you got to believe kind of thing. And if these teams, if these kind of regional religions were owned by the city or region that they were from, If they were owned by the players, maybe I could see, but especially if they were owned by the city, by the fans, I could totally understand using public funds to build ballparks, which are basically public forums. They're these, they're big places where large numbers of people can gather and spend time together and enjoy events, right? And there is real value provided by these venues. Like they exist, they fulfill a purpose beyond even usually just housing a sports team.
Right.
Because most of the time, I mean, if you think about what's it called, the Roomba in Vegas, because it looks like a Roomba, I think.
Yeah.
Right. The Las Vegas Raiders home stadium, like what they have 8 games a season or 9 games. Did they expand it to 18 now? Or...
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So it's basically
so
it's four preseason games.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 of those are at home.
Right.
9 regular season games, and at the most maybe 3 or 4 playoff games. So like at the absolute most, you're playing maybe 14 days out of the year there.
Right. So there's other days for, like, say, a Taylor Swift concert or something, which I ended up not going to. But like there's these stadiums can fill purposes beyond just housing this team. And so you could say, okay, well, if you're going to build it and then the city owns it and the team leases it, that's a reasonable thing that you could maybe do. You could have the city builds it and owns the team that plays there. And then, like, the team's not moving, like the team can't move. The problem is that you have these extraordinarily wealthy individuals who basically own a regional religion, can move it when they want to, if they can get the rest of their cartel to agree to them, because all of these leagues basically function like cartels, right? And
are nonprofits like religion and don't pay. Like the teams are for-profit institutions,
right? But the leagues are nonprofits.
Yeah, the NFL doesn't pay taxes on the billions of dollars it gets from
right.
TV.
So this is all ridiculous, and then they basically hold this sport hostage from either a local populace or the people at large, really. It's like when people say baseball, sometimes they're referring to Major League Baseball, and granted, there are leagues, there are successful big leagues throughout the world outside of the United States and the one city in Canada that currently has a Major League Baseball team. But like the problem is that there's so much power and ownership concentrated in the hands of so few people who already have such massive resources. And then they basically can hold this hostage and say, well, if you don't give us $600 million to build a new stadium, we're going to go to another place that'll give us $600 million to build a new stadium. And it's disgusting, And so if you're a fan of a team like that, it's an awful situation to be in. And I personally, when I said I became a Mets fan in 1986, I was for a number of years. And then I kind of stopped following baseball, but I didn't become like not a fan. I just stopped following it, partially because of the strike. And that's not a knock on the players. That's the whole institution, right, of Major League Baseball. And then I got back into it late 90s, early 2000s, and was mostly following it until 2011. And the way the Mets ownership was dealing with things, and the fact that they didn't even offer a contract to my favorite player, like when he left after winning the batting title, like I was just like, yeah, I'm not a fan anymore, And I followed games here and there, and I watched certain games, and like it was hard to quit. I tried to find another team. I was like, maybe the Cubs. What about the Rays? The Dodgers are interesting, but they're like too good already. Like it's hard to find another team when like you grew up as a kid rooting for one team and having that like lifetime investment. Like that, you can't replace that in the same way. Having those memories. I'm not going to have memories of watching the Cubs with my dad, Yeah. Like, except for, I think, the game that the Mets clinched against them, So, so it's just the fact that there are these people with so much money, so much wealth, and then they have so much power over so many people's lives and their rooting interests. And then they can basically hold that for ransom and get these new parks. I don't know. It's awful. And it makes me not want to pay attention to the whole thing. And then like, you see a great game and it's like, but I love the game, and it's I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah.
I will highlight there's one exception. And I think this is throughout all of like the major professional sports leagues. and probably we need to adjust that because I don't know if that includes like women's hockey and women's basketball, but I believe this is still the only team. The Green Bay Packers are a publicly owned team. I don't understand exactly the terms for it, but it is, you own stock in the team, but it's not like traditional stock. It's non-transferable. You can pass it along to a family member or I think a really close friend, but you can't sell it. There's no intrinsic market value to it, and you can't you don't get dividends for it. But you get to go to a meeting and vote. And if you think that the president's hiring dumb people and they need a new general manager, you go to the meeting and vote.
Right.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But you're right.
Hello.
Other than that,
As an owner of the Packers, I have my one share co-owned with my father. I got it as a Christmas present.
Okay, that's awesome.
Cool.
But yes, Oakland or the A. I guess I will still call them the Oakland A's. It's very meaningful and personal to me because I would say that I was a fan of the Oakland A's post Moneyball. Moneyball, written by Michael Lewis, was what I'm going to say was past tense one of my favorite books and one of my favorite movies. And I loved the story that it told of this upstart, low budget team and how they conquered baseball through statistics, right? That appeals to me on multiple levels. Yeah. And now like the end outcome of that being the A's moving to Las Vegas because the owners were too cheap and too, as Paul has been saying, that they held the city of Oakland hostage.
Right.
That being the end result of the Moneyball story, in my opinion, like because they never put a real competitive team on the field because they're like, oh, but we're the Moneyball A's. We can't spend money. We can't compete with the Yankees. Like that being their excuse to do that to that city and that fandom absolutely disgusts me and has turned me off of, Moneyball as a property of the A's, as an organization. And like a lot of other problematic stuff has come out about Michael Lewis's subjects, right? Like the Michael Orr situation, The Blind Side. He also wrote a book about Sam Bankman-Fried before the crimes came out, where he was like, this guy's a genius, huh? So I'm having a reckoning with Michael Lewis and the subjects he picks and why he writes these books, and it just seems like he's running cover for his rich buddies now is like a thing I have to deal with. And so like this is like our areas of fandom, right? Like fan of a book, fan of a team. I'm like, who am I now? What do I root for?
Yeah, and to fill folks in there, The Blind Side, which is the book that then got turned into the movie, that I want to say Sandra Day O'Connor, but no, she's
Sandra Bullock.
Sandra Bullock, thank you. That's horrible. That I think she got nominated or won an Oscar for. It was a very complicated story, and yes, there was this black kid who didn't really have a home and got taken in by this white family and became a very good football player, and they helped encourage that. But the story got turned into this story of complete white saviorism, and it kind of made Michael look like this really kind of dumb, helpless kid until this white family stepped in. And Michael's been very vocal about like not appreciating that, and I think there's actually some lawsuits now happening between him and.
The issue is less the depiction. It is that they put him. The story is that they adopted him, which is not true. He's in a conservatorship, like the Britney Spears situation, and he was just denied a whole bunch of money that he probably was owed, resulting from the book and successful movie. And the family that quote unquote adopted him just like controlled all this money and like didn't cut him in on what he deserved. And that's why he's suing them.
That makes sense. I do know that he's also spoken about how he had played football before meeting them and really objected to kind of the way he was portrayed in the book and especially the movie. But
100%. Like the depiction is like very racist. But
you're right. When the money gets involved, that's when lawsuits are going to come out for sure. But it because for me, one of the things that I think about, if you're not a sports fan, you don't really kind of understand what we're talking about. Here's another thing that I've experienced, and I think is very much the same thing. This is just sports just makes it larger. One of my first jobs was tenant organizing, and helping renters in buildings with landlords who are doing terrible things. And one of the most traditional things for a landlord to do, especially if they want to be able to sell the building and not have it be renters, but have it be condos or whatever, is to make the conditions so bad in the building that people move out, even if they have rent control, and then they can, sell the building at this huge profit. That's basically exactly what the Oakland A's did.
Yeah.
They made the team so bad. I've been to that stadium many times, and in the summer, it's utterly miserable because you're right under the sun. It's outside enough of the Bay Area that it doesn't get like the cool weather. There's almost no shade. You're in direct sunlight for most of the game. Or because of where it is on the water, it can sometimes even get cold at night. There's very few bathrooms. There's very few like good concession stands. They just made it a miserable experience. And so people didn't want to go, as well as, like, as you were saying, not making it a very good team. So people didn't want to watch. And then they were able to say, hey, Major League Baseball, there's not enough people to support a team here. I've got to move. And it's just, it is destroying a public resource so that you can make a profit out of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's despicable when landlords do it. And I think you're right. It's despicable when baseball owners do it. And I want to be able to say it's this one individual owner, but the fact is that, like, we know that Major League Baseball can force the sale of a team. They've done it in the past. A number of sports have. When the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers came out saying a number of horrifically racist things, and particularly about the players, the NBA forced him to sell. When I think it was the owner of Jeff Lurie, the owner of the Montreal Expos, was just running that team into the ground. Major League Baseball forced him to sell, and then wound up taking over the team and then moving them to Washington. And but with this guy, they're like, no, the whole sport itself was like, no, this is a perfectly fine way to do it. And this is the most recent example, but a number of teams have done this recently.
Yeah, and I just want to put a name to all this. John Fisher is the principal owner of the Oakland A's, the son of Gap founders Donald Fisher and Doris Fisher. So yeah, he had a lot of family money and put it into this team to buy it, but then has, cynically not invested in either the players or the infrastructure of the stadium.
Now, Riki, I know, obviously I've heard you talk about Shohei Ohtani and other Japanese players that really mean a lot to you. Are you knowledgeable at all about the Japanese baseball league? Because I'm kind of curious if similar dynamics happen there.
No, I don't know a thing. I mean, okay. I know a few players, but I don't know anything about the business side. They're like, it's more company based, I think, right?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure the teams are owned by companies, like the names instead of.
Yeah, like the Giants are the Yomiuri Giants. So Yomiuri is a newspaper.
Oh yeah. Well, Nintendo owned the Seattle Mariners for a good deal of time. They may still.
Yeah, and I think they owned the team that Ichiro played on, and so the whole posting fee thing was a little. As a Mets fan, I'm salty because, like, basically, Nintendo basically traded him to their Major League Baseball
transferred
team.
To their Seattle office.
Exactly. And the Mets were the team that made the second best bid. And, like, I would have loved to watch Ichiro, like, regularly. I mean, he would have been my favorite player if I was able to like watch him regularly. I mean, he's exactly the type of player that I always loved. Instead, the Mets got Tsuyoshi Shinjo, who, also played baseball. Actually had a lot more flash. He had those huge orange bands. I had a Shinjo jersey and a Jay Payton. Those were like the ones that I ended up getting. But like, yeah, it's the whole dynamic between NPB and MLB is very interesting and fraught. And but I am pretty sure that it's it's the Oryx Buffaloes, the Rakuten Golden Eagles. Like, there's a lot of teams that I believe those are company names, right? Those aren't like cities. Yeah. And like I've gone to a game in Seoul in the Korean Baseball League, and it was actually 2002, the year before they started using those thunder sticks in the the Angels in the World Series, and they used them there. But it was two teams who I think both of their home stadium was Seoul, and it was the Doosan Bears against the LG Twins, like LG, the electronics company. or they make a lot of things, but, and like you had the fans of each team on a separate, like you got first base or third base line based on like what team you were rooting for. And then there's like cheerleaders like on the top of the dugout, like between innings with like coordinated cheering. And but so it's like it is a different dynamic, but it's companies instead of individual wealthy people, which I don't know how much different that is. Like, is that better? Is that worse? I don't know. But like, you know,
I think it probably depends on like the leadership, because in terms of like baseball or like US sports teams owners, like we talk about like the owner as an individual person, right? Like Jerry Jones is the owner of the Dallas Cowboys,
right?
And so there's this sense that he makes all the decisions and he has like final say on stuff, whereas if it's a company, presumably there's like a board that collectively makes a decision, and that makes it feel a little more comfortable for us, even though if there's like 10 people on a board, they're probably equally rich and evil from our perspective, in terms of their decision making. But it distributes that evil among 10 people rather than like one single figure.
Like the only company ownership of a team in American sports I can think of, and I'm sure there is an individual, I think it's like a family owned business, but Miller, the beer company, owns the Milwaukee Brewers. And mostly I just know about that because when I lived in Madison, Milwaukee was the best place to go to see a baseball game. And so I tried to see the Mets every time they came, and you couldn't get any good beer because you could only buy Miller beer products.
And like they play in Miller State, right? What's
they play in Miller Park.
Well,
we've been a little over an hour, and we do have a little bit of bonus content we're going to talk about. In our bonus content, we're going to talk about sports fiction and some of our favorite sports movies and things like that. Let me just kind of ask you then, as a wrap-up question, and I think I'm going to pose the question and then I'm going to give my own answer, which is, given all of this, and we've barely scratched the surface of some of the problems in sports. I think this is less true in baseball, but certainly in basketball and football, but also somewhat in baseball. Like, I think there's a lot of arguments that particularly in men's sports, it can encourage some of the worst aspects of, and like, you look at the rates of domestic violence among professional athletes, and it's, almost as high as cops, which I'm not saying flippantly, like the rate of cops is incredibly high. Among football players and stuff like that, it's also quite high. I think in sports in general, but especially football players. There's obviously the incredible health risks in football, but also in a lot of other things as well. There's a lot, I think there's a very good argument to be made that a lot of the opioid crisis that's being faced in America right now is a lot having to do with high school athletics and the way high school athletics is treated and how hard high school kids are pushed, and that then leading to injuries that then they're overprescribed for opioids and things like that. There's so many problems we haven't listed. Why are we still fans?
Were you going to answer that first, or you want to?
Yeah, I was, and then I was going to debate if I should. And I think for me, the thing that I will say is, and I'm going to ask the question and then immediately say why I think it's not entirely a fair question.
Okay.
Because I think if you say that because of the terrible businesses that surround sports, you should not be a fan of sports at all, then you also shouldn't watch Marvel movies or anything owned by Disney or any of these other huge entertainment companies. Or, which is not to be flippant and say, so not care. I definitely, the things I watch and do is influenced by my feelings on the ownership of those things. I'm just saying that I think that sometimes sport, and the same way, like not just that, but also like how much military propaganda is in MCU movies, and how much like, misogyny is in so many of the kind of movies that, rom-coms and stuff like that, although they're getting better. But like, I watch a lot of my favorite movies again from the 80s, and I'm like, oh man, there was a lot of homophobia in this movie that is just not needed in the slightest. And like,
because sometimes it is needed. That was a joke. No, it was I was saying something because of the way you said it. Like you said, which is not needed.
Exactly.
Because sometimes it is needed.
Never needed.
No,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, unless the point is that's the story.
Sometimes we need homophobia. I was like, Paul,
it's like a shortcut of characterization for this character is an a-hole.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or just like, look, it's okay that we have them be close male friends because they make a joke and use the F word,
Right.
The F slur. So not the curse.
Yeah, no, yeah, the other bad word that's really actually worse that should be called the F
the
word.
2-syllable one.
Yeah.
But yeah, my point being that I just think that like I think sometimes Sportsball, and I'm saying that kind of ironically because that's the kind of a term that's used for people who don't like it. Sports plays an outdate. Sports has a huge part in our society that probably is far more than it should be. And until recently, like being a fan of sports was considered okay. Being a fan of the MCU was not. And I think at least that's changing to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get why there's so much hostility towards sports fandom. And I think a lot of it's justified. But I think that especially now, it's worth looking in more detail at why are we sometimes like almost kind of knee-jerkedly, rejecting of sports fandom in a way that we're not of comic book movie fandom or, some other thing that or often the industries about it can be just as problematic and awful.
I mean, I guess my answer would be like, I'm not sure. Like the other day, I made a joke where I said, you can call me a fan, because for over 10 years, I was like, yeah, don't call me a fan. Like that's not the word I would use. And it was like, just realizing that I actually really did care a lot about the outcome of one baseball game. But like at the same time, like I'm not a fan of the institution. Like I won't pay money to go to a baseball game. I won't pay money to watch a baseball game. Like I have access to some and I enjoy that and appreciate it. But I have deliberately for over a decade said, no, I'm not giving you any of my money, and it's like, I'm giving you my attention and I am talking about it. And that's the currency, but like, I've got my ad blocker on when I'm watching your videos online. Like, it's, and so that's kind of, to me, that's my compromise of like, I don't want to financially support the system and the institution. Specifically, I'm mostly talking about Major League Baseball, because other sports I just haven't really. I mean, I paid to see some tennis games back in the day, the US Open and whatever. But like, so to me, it's kind of like, I don't know if I would characterize myself as a fan, broadly speaking. I would say that I currently care about the outcome of baseball games for a particular team. And I love the game. And so it's like, well, if this is the game played at the highest level, like I tried to find like a Mexican league team to root for. Like, I tried to read more like about, Japanese baseball or Korean baseball. Like it's difficult to change sometimes, and you know what I mean? Baseball is not even vegan, really. I mean, it's like the amount of leather used in these things. Like I don't want to support that either. That's like a personal quandary for me as well. And so I feel like having an emotional investment, but not a financial investment, is to me kind of where I say, okay, this is where I'm going to draw the line for myself. And I think everybody just has to do that for themselves.
Not to completely derail us, but I've never thought about this before. I now am wondering, is there a vegan leather product that, like, are there any players who are vegans and or vegetarians even, and just don't, and have gloves that are not made out of animal product?
I'm not aware of that. I haven't really looked into it. I mean, I know Colin Kaepernick's a vegan and has a Ben & Jerry's non-dairy flavor. Changed the world, like WHIRL. Okay. But like, no, I'm not sure. I mean, I do know that those products exist. Like you can get a mitt and a ball that are not made with leather. But I'm not sure how widespread they are. And like, if I was like really into baseball, like actively like wanting to be involved more, like I would actually try and push for that to be more of the thing, I mean, I haven't bought a glove since I was a kid, since my parents bought me a glove, basically. The last one was my Keith Hernandez mitt that he signed and looked at and was like, yeah, you beat this to hell. Like you've played some first base with this. But like, yeah, it's, I don't know. I don't know much about that now.
All right. Back to the original question, Riki.
I would say that I'm not a fan of sports. So this week I've been reading a book. It's called Fans, subtitle A Journey into the Psychology of Belonging by Michael Bond. And it talks about sports fandom of, like Marvel Comics, MCU, and also delves into how it relates to politics and nationalism, because that's what we're talking about, is like a group. We're a group, right?
Yeah.
We're a group that identifies as something, and often is the case that we oppose something else, like another team, another country, another political party, and these overlap a lot. And it's coming at this time, you know, in this country, when there's an election coming up, a very consequential election, and people are reckoning with their identity, right? Like, how do you identify Democrat or Republican, as a person living in the United States, right? Like, all of these things matter. And so going back to sports, because of a lot of the things we've talked about, the problematic things, like even the Olympics, I didn't really, like I said, I didn't watch the Olympics that much this year, because the IOC is such a corrupt institution. And I'm like, the more I find out about the way they conduct their business, and how they, similar to the discussion about the A's, how they basically like blackmail countries into like buying, spending money on the infrastructure, and won't support a country getting an Olympic Games until they do, it is like, it's hard. Like, business, the more you find out about the business of sports, the harder it is to be a fan, in my opinion. And that's where I am right now. It's like, I don't really watch that much because of that, like, because I don't like being reminded.
Yeah.
But I have a few people I follow on social media who are like sports journalists, and they post updates and clips and stuff. I'm like, I enjoy watching those. So that's the kind of fan I've become. This past month, Shohei Ohtani's chase of 50-50 home runs and stolen bases was the most I've been engaged with sports in quite some time. And that's the level of fandom I am now. Like I said, I'm a fan of Shohei Ohtani. I was a fan of this chase of a historical milestone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that all that's important. I think, to me, part of what that all gets to is that there's middle ground between being like a hardcore fan and calling it all sports ball and hating all of it. And I think all of us are finding that in our own different ways. I know for me, like last night, I got a nice memory of how much these things still matter to me. And I think I'm probably more of a fan than either of the two of you, but still a lot more separated from it used to be. Last night, we're recording this on Thursday, October 17th. Last night, in the third game of the playoffs, the Mets got blown out. It was a horrible game. And, you know, it was not a fun feeling to watch. But I'm fine now. 10, 15 years ago, I would have watched that game, watched the Mets get destroyed, and it just would have wrecked me. I think it was 2007 where the Mets made this like epic collapse towards the end of their season. I wound up losing in a 1-game playoff to the Padres after it seemed like they should win the division and not even have to deal with a wild card. And it wrecked me for like 2 weeks. And part of that's because my mental health itself is a lot better than it was back in those days, but also just I think my relationship to it has changed a lot. And Colin Kaepernick was a big part of that. I think I'm still, you know, for a while I didn't engage in football at all. And then I slowly came back to it. And I still wonder about that sometimes. Sometimes I think it's not the best ethical thing I do these days, but I also am a big believer in the whole idea of like, you have to pick your battles, you know, and like, I spend more money to support sports than Paul does. I spend money so that Paul can talk to me about sports. But there are other things that I boycott that other people don't, you know, and I think, you know, we have to kind of make our own choices in all of that. And yeah, I just think this is a great discussion, and I'm really glad we're having it. And I hope that we're going to continue it because I do know that Emily Sissel, who is a fantastic content creator, she's been on this podcast a couple times. Her husband runs a sports podcast that deals with these ethical questions. So I'm sure at some point, maybe around the Super Bowl, we're going to do something like this again and have him on. So yeah, I don't think this will be the last time we're talking about it.
Cool.
I want to touch on one final thing, if that's okay.
Go for it.
The term sports ball, I don't like it.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a slur. Like, it's not a slur on the level of like a racial slur, but it is a term you are using to denigrate other people's enjoyment of something, and I just don't like that. Like, I have my opinions on sports and the business and all that, and I've withdrawn a little, but I don't hate people who enjoy sports. I want people to enjoy sports. I wish I could enjoy them back to that level again, but I just can't.
Yeah.
But if you do, like, that's fantastic, and you should enjoy it. And I just don't like the way that often, like in the geek circles, people use Sportsball as just like, oh, you like sports type of thing. I just don't think that's where we should be.
Yeah, I feel like it's this very counterproductive, like us and them kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, can't we just all be us? Like, you know, and people can, I don't know. I mean, as a kid and as a young adult and a teenager, like I always had these like disparate interests that like were not, you know, the things that people think of as being geeky or whatever, which is a word that I hate for what it's worth. I understand it's largely been reclaimed, but all of those words I don't like for the same reasons basically. But like I do feel like it's like just let people like what they like, you know. And I understand sometimes there is this it's more, I find it more understandable when people like something that has been maligned and then are maligning something else that has been historically more broadly appreciated. And like I can understand that as a reaction, but that doesn't mean it's a good reaction or that it's like a positive, helpful thing. It's just I understand it. You know, I have empathy for that position. But at the same time, I'm like, just different people like different things. Some people like things that cross over that you wouldn't expect. And like that's cool. Like to each their own, you know.
Yeah.
So you know, and that doesn't mean not to be critical of the things that are issues with any of those things. But like, you know, like you said earlier, Matthew, like, yeah, most of these things have issues when, especially when you start talking about the big money, big corporate type stuff. It's like, there's going to be some stuff, you know, and that's how it is, you know?
No, I think it's very true. And that's honestly why I included the word in the title, because that's kind of where the perspective I think we were kind of coming from. I mean, to some extent, I feel like part of what we're doing with this podcast is being like, hey, fellow, like lovers of comic book movies and things like that, we also love sports, and that's not a terrible thing. Or we also have some positive feelings towards sports.
Right.
And then it's not, I do think to some extent, the fact that I am in a minority for enjoying sports in most of the communities that I'm in is both frustrating, but also part of why I'm able to enjoy those things. Because I do feel like I have a lot of disagreements and a lot of like uncomfortableness with the way a lot of sports fans are.
Yeah, for sure.
But I also think that, and I do think, like, you know, I got bullied in high school for being not very athletic and being into, you know, not comic books, but like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, primarily by the jocks in my school. And I think there is both some truth to the jocks bully nerds dynamic. I also think it's a mentality that has been massively overplayed by most of the media of that time. And that people sometimes hear about, you know, a sports figure who also plays Dungeons and Dragons, and they're like, oh my God, how could that be? And the fact is, that lots of people, you know, people are not either jocks or squares or nerds or goths. Like, people are much more complicated than that, and they have feet in all of these different directions. And so I think in many ways that's kind of the mission statement of any of this podcast, is that it is completely okay to not enjoy sports. It is completely okay to. I the same way I'm kind of like, this is going to be a weird connection and probably one that you two may not share, but and so I shouldn't end it with this. But with the three of us, we go on for a while. I feel about sports kind of similar to the way I feel about religion, in that, like, there's a lot of horrible things associated with it, and a lot of people in my life have been very traumatized by it, and I have never will ask you to see it differently. But also, I see some positives from it, and I enjoy some of those things because of those positives. And I think it's not a perfect comparison, because I think the damage. There have been people killed in like sports riots, and that's not good. But like the Crusades,
the numbers are low by comparison. The numbers are low.
But it just in that kind of idea of like, I think, if anything, I think the message of this podcast is, or at least for me, is like, you know, it's easy to paint sports with a broad brush, and especially for it to be, like you said, like, we've been marginalized by the jocks for so long. Whereas today, like, as I understand it, like, if you want to get beaten up in high school, a good way to do it is say you don't like comic books. Like, you know, not that I think it's physical beating up, but like, you know, that the days of like the comic book nerd is the social outcast is not the case anymore. And basically just agreeing with you guys about Sportsball, and now going off on a couple of stupid tangents. So,
I think it's probably overblown, like the dichotomy between jocks and nerds. Because thinking back to my time in the Magic the Gathering circles, like one of my best friends, Jared, was a huge New England Patriots fan, right?
Oh yeah,
he talked about them all the time. I remember another person who called American football hand egg, right? Like that's like another kind of way to denigrate that sport.
Yeah.
But he was a huge soccer fan.
Right.
For the Portland team. I can't remember what they're called. So I think like the average nerd is probably a fan of some team.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think just a lot of people grow up liking sports and a lot don't, but like it does cut across all sorts of subcultures and
And I think that's also because, at least for me, when I was a kid, being into sports meant you were a straight white male, or you were someone who's interested in a straight white male. And there's a lot of I think there's often a lot of very misogynistic stereotypes of like women only liked sports because that's where they saw the hot guys or whatever. Right. Whereas today, like people of all genders, people of all sexual orientations, people of like trans, straight, all of this can really be into sports. And of course that raises all sorts of other questions. Like we didn't even talk about trans women in sports, which I think is another place of like huge problematicness where to be clear, I'm another place of huge problematicness where, I think a marginalized community is getting attacked and denigrated by people who don't really care much about women's sports. They just want a way to slam dunk on out of their transphobia, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, we could keep going on. We're going to have what I hope is a brief after section for our members. Of course, you can become a member by just paying $5 a month, $55 a year. All the information's on our show notes. There's like 3 other things I should have read ads for, but I'm still really bad at this and I'm learning. I'm trying, folks. But send us feedback. Become a member. It's how we keep the lights on. I have improved the sound quality, and your memberships make that a lot easier. Help to pay for these things. Help to pay, keep the lights on. Help to, all these good things. So, on behalf of myself, Riki, Paul, thank you so much. JETS, Jets. Once they sell the team.